I think most people, and maybe many of you listening, are going through some season of waiting, or things just aren't right. But you can't figure it out. Keep going. Dig into healthy habits and dig into Scripture, most importantly. Dig into prayer. Hang in there. Just keep going.
Good day and welcome to the Consultant and the Coach podcast. I'm here with my good buddy, Josh. How are you, my friend?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm just jumping from point to point to point because I like doing that.
It's fun.
But you know what? Nothing's more frustrating in business than getting to the bottom of a problem as a leader of your business, but it's hard when one gets distracted by shiny things. And I might be speaking from experience.
You?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Squirrel?
What?
But yeah, you're right. I get distracted easy. So today is ADHD in the workplace, and it comes from my perspective as a CEO who I would say I have struggled with it, and now I've kind of come to grips. This is who I am. But before we jump into it, let's the scripture verse I picked out is Romans 8:26 to 27. Do you want to read those two verses? Do you have them?
Go for it. Go for it.
So Romans 8:26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with His groanings too deep for words. And He who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for saints according to the will of God. Now, that's not a verse on ADHD, but it's talking about weakness, and we are all different, and God helps us as we ask Him for help. And I want to jump, and the reason why I want to talk about this, I was thinking back to as I started the business that I currently run back in 2004, and things were going great for a number of years. And we were growing, we were becoming profitable, and it was really fascinating. I was just thriving, absolutely thriving, until we weren't. And it was almost overnight. And I've had a chance to go back and look at this, and it was really when we hit about 12 employees. Hindsight being 20.
And just for context, How long were you in business from time of start to 12? So give some context of time.
4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So moving from
zero to 12
to thriving 4 years. Okay.
And we're talking no business, sales funnel, growing it. So anyway, I hit 12 employees, and what I realized, at the time I was just frustrating, and I was like, I couldn't get it all done, and all of a sudden I started getting depressed. I couldn't. So I started seeing a counselor. I went to a doctor. This doctor gave me an antidepressant, and it kind of helped for a little bit until it didn't. And this was a long thing. I had to learn to scale my business, change how I led, all sorts of other things. But on the backside, I was depressed that I couldn't do more. I was frustrated.
Okay.
I have an amazing doctor. And we have conversations. We kept working at things. I tweaked my antidepressant, went on it, went off it, tried all sorts of other things. And there was a day about 3, 4, 5 years ago. He goes, "Hey, how about we try Ritalin?" I'm like, "Sure, we've tried everything else." It was amazing. It was like I opened my eyes and could think. So if all of a sudden you're in a really noisy environment, and you put on noise-canceling headphones, and you can all of a sudden think.
Like on an airplane.
Absolutely.
Feels great.
That is what happened to me overnight. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Now,
I was like 39, 40 years old.
I want to catch something for our listeners here that you just said. You were in a season, you said, from 4 years to the start of your business to only 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. How long was that period?
About another 9 years.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Of being frustrated.
Yeah. So you were in a rough season for 9 years. You were sort of, not only
working my tail off.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like driving a car that's out of alignment. Your car will still drive out of alignment, but what should get 28 miles a gallon might get 24.
Yeah.
Tires that should last 80,000 miles, 40.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when we are not running optimized as God has made us. And that's truly what happened with me. And I realized what I thought was one thing. And after reading it, I realized, reading the literature, is a lot of people who are depressed are not depressed where that's the primary diagnosis. It's the result of being frustrated because I'm like, this has got to work better. And it wasn't.
Well, and I think one thing I would just want to point out for people listening to this, if you are hearing ADHD and thinking, well, that has nothing to do with me. One thing I just want to point out there that I think resonates, at least for me, is that I think most people, and maybe many of you listening, are going through some season of waiting where things just aren't right. And it may not be a medical diagnosis, may not be ADHD, but you can't figure it out. And I would just say, hang in there, keep going, dig into, healthy habits, and dig into scripture, most importantly, dig into prayer, and keep going. I tell that most people I talk to when I'm talking through, we get so funny when I talk to people about consulting. I sort of become a quasi-counselor just because these things come up, right? And most of what I find myself telling people is, pick your problem. Hey, hang in there, just keep going, and then you'll have these things open up. But these seasons are long.
Well, they're very long, and it was one of those things. So I want to throw out a couple terms. There's a term in psych, but kind of in the field, called neurotypical versus neurodivergent. And because I honestly hate terms such as ADHD or autistic or you name your psych term of the day, but there's neurotypical, and you can. Josh, you are perfectly neurotypical. You're very rational. You look at problems and you nail them. A, then B, then C, and it should be fixed. But you understand.
In my mind, it should be fixed. It rarely is.
You're very neurotypical. And it was, I someone who has ADHD or any other would be called neurodivergent. And, neurodivergence is the term when someone's brain processes, learns, or behaves differently from other people who are considered typical.
Can you give a percentage on that if we're thinking about people who are in the bucket of typical, the bucket of divergent? Do we have a sense of that in terms of what we're talking about?
This has no... Please don't quote me on this. I'm going to say roughly 15%.
Okay.
So
just for those listening.
And
okay.
I'm going to...
And that's not ADHD. That's anybody kind of neurodivergent.
That could be autistic, ADHD. It could be... There are all sorts of different degrees. And I'm going to talk... It actually is going to seem higher than that. I'll get into that a little later. But basically, there's neurotypical and neurodivergent. But here's the thing. What happens when we have to play together? And what happened, and this is why, as we've talked about certain things such as strength finders or personalities, when you get people of different personalities or we're wired differently, there can be great frustration. And however, when we work together, there can be great benefit. And so it's just like, well, what do you do when there's all sorts of different people within a business? What do you do?
How do you manage it? I mean, from an ADHD or neurodivergent perspective, how do you think about it? Well,
first, from my perspective, as someone who has ADHD, there's a number of ways of treating it. This is not a podcast on doing that. Some people, for me, medication's been very, very helpful. Other people, you don't have to medicate it. But for example, for me, scheduling is vital. So I'll give an example of a young man who is maybe all over the board. That has ADHD, goes off to the U.S. military, knocks it out of the park, unmedicated. Why does he do such a great job in the military? Let's just think about this for a second. Highly scheduled. You don't get to at 6:15 say, instead of doing what my drill sergeant asked me to do, I'm going to do this instead. I want to paint pictures. That's not an option. You do this, then you do this, then you do this. So a highly structured environment are great for people with ADHD. Or even if it's not going to be structured, set structured time to free think. So for me, what has really benefited, I run a very regimented schedule in terms of, okay, for example, Josh and I, we podcast every Monday, but then I also have portions of my schedule that are free think time. I have nothing on my schedule. I can do whatever I want for these 4 hours or this day. So lots of scheduling like that has proved really beneficial for me. And that's one of the things. There's food, there's all sorts of other things. I could literally, what I've been learning the last 5 years is off the chart. So as you've consulted with other organizations, with people who, let's say, have ADHD or let's say some form of somewhere on the autistic spectrum, what do you think as you jump into organizations? Because you've consulted with teeny organizations as well as huge organizations. What do you think when you look at that?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind, thinking about your story of interestingly, and curious to know the research on this, but it's interesting you said that you didn't really seem to begin to suffer the obvious effects of your ADHD until you reached a certain, what I would call cognitive load in a particular leadership role. And my guess is a lot of leaders are very similar. You stack on growth and people and revenue, and if you didn't or were not previously diagnosed with a particular condition for some reason in school or whatever else, you actually might not find out about these particular issues until you build the stress level up in your, what I would call cognitive load. Again, I can talk about that if helpful, but I think leaders I've worked with don't actually realize the depth of their dysfunction until they're forced to function at a level beyond their capabilities with those limitations, right?
And in an effort to scale, the only way you can scale is to get to the bottom. Like, how can I grow even more?
The leader has to grow with the company, and the capacity for managing a certain amount of load, whether that's a small 2-person company or whether that's a multinational company, right? Those individuals have to have some amount of capacity building within themselves, and if they can't, then they have to go find the resources from a professional development perspective to enable them, and or obviously hire the right people. But I think there is certainly limitations that people find they don't realize they have until their company grows to a particular level. And that's actually one other quick funny joke I would say is that's one reason why I think, you're talking about squirrel and blue cars and whatnot, but I find it's funny in strategic planning, there's almost this culture of ADHD in companies. So there's almost a component where the culture or the company takes on its own personality. Even if the particular leader isn't diagnosed with ADHD, I find it funny how many executive teams suffer from ADHD as a team.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Which is sort of funny, right? And I've never analyzed to see if the actual personalities had particular issues like that. But it's so funny in strategic planning where someone will say, oh, I talked to some person at a conference. Come back and tell us all about the yellow car. Okay, great. Go do a bunch of research on the yellow car. You bring it back to them and they go, oh, no. That's why would we ever do that? I never asked for that. You'd say, wait a second. And they would go chase the blue car. Go chase the red car. Go chase.
But you allude to a good point. It's like, what do we do with those side tangent ideas?
Yeah.
And I even in my own life if someone were to sit next to me on my desk all day long, I actually have a piece of white paper next to me every single day. This is literally one of my tools. It's the high-tech tool of a piece of pen and paper. And I always write down my entire train of thoughts that comes into my head. Because what happens with someone with ADHD is you have to get it out of your head to get back to your original thought. So for example, you say, well, Eric, we're working on this, but what about the blue car? I would write down blue car. So I can get back to the original idea. Then what I do with that piece of paper, the next day when I come into work, I look at my previous list of side thoughts, and typically 8 of the 10 are shreddable. I'm just like, well, that was dumb. And so then I shred the piece of paper. And then the 2 ideas that I do want to keep, I write down for that next day. And then over the course of a week, I'm like, okay, actually, I do want to go down these tangents because they would be really beneficial for our business. So things like that, I've had to learn to incorporate in, someone might say, all of us have a version of ADHD. Well, kind of, but we're talking today, diagnosable. There are, people who actually have the diagnosis of ADHD.
Well, I like how you describe what you do with those thoughts, because what that brought to mind is working with, I don't remember the name of the methodology, but one of the many things around creative and innovation thinking that I've heard as a way to do it is actually taking your paper when you're listening to a presentation or in a meeting, right? And you draw, first, before you even start the meeting, you draw a line down the middle. And on the left is where you're taking notes about the meeting. And all of us, ADHD or not, probably just happens more frequently, I'm guessing. You move what's called in and out, right? Because certain things will be said, right? Someone will be talking and all of a sudden they'll say, blue flower, because it has something to do with the presentation. But your mind all of a sudden transfers to a flower that's blue in a field you were one time driving down an interstate with the love of your life, right? And also you're out, right? And so anything you think of, you begin writing on the right side of the line. And you just allow yourself to trail that thought as long as it goes. And as soon as you can get it out, you come back to the left side, you re-engage in the presentation, you keep going, right? And this in and out thinking actually is a great tool, regardless of your neurotypical or neurodivergent level, I suppose.
Absolutely.
But I'm just guessing ADHD folks probably spend more time in the right lane.
Now, one of the things that I have found really helpful is I've taken, I don't want to say my diagnosis, but I use it hand in hand with StrengthsFinder. And because, there's 34 different examples over StrengthsFinder. And what it does is it lets me know where my strengths are as well as my weaknesses. So on StrengthsFinder, you'll also, if you pay for the test, you get a bottom 5 as well too. If I ever find myself hanging out in the bottom 5, for me that's just like a red light. I need to give that to my assistant, or if I am working on it, someone is walking me through, because it is not an area of specialty for me. So that's a way that I use to manage it as well too. And even better, you have your StrengthsFinder for your team. If you know what their bottom 5 are, those are areas you don't let them do that by themselves, or you make sure they're followed up on the very next day when you ask. Because what I've had some amazing team members that have ADHD, and every time I've given them too long of a rope in an area of not one of their strengths, they blow up. It's just like, and I've lost some great team members, and I'm like, yep, that's my fault as a leader. So this is where, even if you're neurotypical, if you realize you have one of those team members on your team, they can fire themselves. It's their fault, but at the same time, this is why the U.S. military does such a good job with people who have learning disabilities, such as ADHD. Untreated, it works because they have such a great structure. I have other people, even though this is a podcast about ADHD, who are autistic, amazing team members, because I figure out how to use the way God has made them so that they succeed in business and in life. So a lot of this is just understanding how God has made us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, back to faith in the workplace, I think it's recognizing that there is a diversity to humanity that we have to be mindful of, right? And how we respect and incorporate that into the business, such that we are also, back to the last episode, only focusing on planting and reaping.
Absolutely, and that's right. Spot on.
Yeah, and there's certainly ways, I think, we won't get into in this podcast, but there's certainly ways that I think pockets of society, pockets of business over-index on that, right? You can over-resource that in ways that are unhealthy, that take you beyond the mission and waste, frankly, money of your ownership and or your stockholders. But there's certainly an opportunity there when you set up that work environment to respect that diversity of like neurotypical and neurodivergent.
And work environment's vitally critical, especially for someone with ADHD, even also people who don't. And I was looking at some of my younger team members, and I'm like, man, it looks like they all have ADHD. What's up with this? Now, they don't. I know what the research says. Typically about 15% of the population, 10, depending on how you look at it and how you diagnose it. Well, why do so many people look? Cell phones,
social media.
Because what happens is...
Now we sound old.
We're really old. But the reason why I bring this up is I would strongly, and my HR at my company understands why I don't want to see cell phones. If you were to be my employee, I don't want to see you with your cell phone in your hand, because it will distract you. And the amount of time it takes you to come back is astronomical. So cell phones should not be kept on our sales floor. It should not be, and even myself, when I get into a time of hard work, I turn off my iPads and my iPhones. I put them on airplane mode. They're still on so I can take notes, but I don't want any sort of notifications that might get me out of hyperfocus on a tangent. Hey, what's going on at cross-country practice tonight? Vitally important at 5:30, not at 11:45 in the morning as I'm working on a really hard project. And so how do we handle, whether or not one has ADHD or a team member, how do we structure our environment so people succeed?
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that is just recognizing human limitations too, right? I mean, there's just, people can only hold, and I guess it goes back to that. There's an issue that I've done a lot of work with my clients around cognitive load and trying to measure that for teams. And I think, leaders have a limit to their cognitive load. Teams have a limit to their cognitive load. It varies person to person for sure. But I think one thing we underestimate, probably more than we should, is the impact of phones, distractions, social media, etc., on one's cognitive load, right? Because the more notifications, the more pings, and the more you're doing what's basically called, I think it's called context switching, right? And that is the enemy of speed and efficiency.
It is.
So if you can eliminate the context switching in your mind, there's so much wasted slack that occurs when you do that, that it's enormous, the amount of efficiency that's lost. And so, not to complicate the two, but basically I think one of the culprits there is certainly people's attachment to social media and sort of this idea that you can just context switch from friend to friend to friend to friend and issue and picture, news media outlet, and it's great. It's good for time wasting, but it's not good for efficiency in the workplace.
It's not. And, a couple weeks ago, you took a media holiday and you went up to the mountains.
I need to go back.
And I kept saying, man, Josh, you're on fire. Why? You had all this focused time. You didn't go wide. You went deep.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you get a neurotypical combined with increased concentration. You were rolling, man.
Yeah.
And I need to do that as well.
Then it came back and it hit me like a wave. But anyhow,
but even myself,
that's for another podcast.
Last week I was out backpacking in the mountains. I turned my device off for 2 full days. It was amazing. So, there are a number of things, looking at ADHD from a CEO's perspective, from a coach's perspective. I'm on the front lines, but whether or not that is you or you have a team member or employee, you at least need to be aware of it and what that looks like. And I would say, if you're unsure, if this is coming out of you from left field, there's some really good literature on that. Dive into that. Reach out to us because we understand what it's like to lead and to consult in these environments, and also how to really thrive.
Yes.
So for me, it's not a disability. It's one of those things. I have the ability to become hyper-focused and go really, really deep. But where it is a weakness, I've learned to compensate for that appropriately.
Right. Yeah, and I think, whatever challenges or issues, I would say, not even challenges, I would say whatever issues of diversity your workforce is facing, reach out to us, right? Because part of what we would do is apply all the stuff we're talking about here to any number of other topics, which I think we may even address some of them in the future episodes, to help you, maximize your business, right? We're all about trying to help our clients overcome all the challenges they face, and one of these of personnel diversity is a huge one right now. And we'll get into more of that, I think, in future episodes.
Can we have that be our next episode?
Yes.
Yes, let's just do it. And it's funny.
Are we going to do the episode after 3 beers, or how many beers are we going to drink before we have the episode?
Yeah, if only I were still drinking, so that's going to make it even harder, too.
We won't.
So nothing more than a little Pellegrino.
There you go.
All that will be, but we'll
maybe kombucha.
Or we'll dive down diversity next. And it's kind of funny. Josh told me, evidently, there's some new term, and he's like, "You've never heard that term?" No, I've never heard that term. I'm sorry. So this is where it's funny, where some of you, if you rise to a certain point in your business, that's really cool because you kind of get to make up the rules yourself, but you still have to be aware of what's going on in other businesses. But we'll talk about diversity next. Next week, it'll be fun from both, a consultant's perspective. You've been in all sorts of organizations who do treat it differently. Granted, mine's coming from a Central Washington mom and pop organization coach's point of view, which is drastically different as well too.
Yeah, we'll have some fun with it.
But in the meantime, hey, if you have questions on ADHD in the workplace, coaching wise, I would love to talk to you. Consulting wise, reach out to Josh. Go to theconsultantcoach.com, and until next week, we look forward to hearing from you.
Sounds good. Take care, everybody.